In Acts chapter 27 tonight, this is Paul on his sailing journey to Rome, and before that happens, he becomes shipwrecked. So let's pick the account up. After having just appeared before Felix and Festus and Agrippa, it's now been determined that they know he did nothing worthy of death or even to be imprisoned. But as a Roman citizen, he claimed that he wanted to go before Caesar. And they said, okay, we're compelled by our law to send him to Caesar. So he's on his way to Rome. Verse 1. And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one Julius, a centurion of Augustus' hand. And entering into the ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia. One Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. The next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends and refresh himself. Very unusual as a prisoner, but that says a lot about how Paul's personality influenced those that held him captive. Verse 4, and when he had launched from there, went and sailed to Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when they had sailed over to the Sea of Sicily and Pamphylia, they came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. And we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Sindus, the wind did suffer us. We sailed under Crete, over against Salmon, and hardly passing it came into a place which is called the Fair Havens, near whereunto the city of Lycia. So just a moment ago we saw on the map, you hear some of the places that they passed. Luke does a very good job of tracing where the sailing's happening, where the trip is. And again, I like the fact that the Word of God mentions real people's names that we won't hear again, that really serve no huge importance as far as any stories about them later on, but it's factually correct. Is Luke just writing about Paul's experience with the leaders on the way? Julius was kind enough to let Paul be refreshed to Christians. He let him go ashore and have his friends comfort him. And that was unusual. But that shows us Paul was not like the other prisoners. Many of these on the boat with him were hardened criminals, which had committed crimes they were guilty of, and they were worthy of death. Paul wasn't like that, of course. He was an innocent man among those who were guilty. We're going to find out later that Paul was one of 276 men on this ship. I'll get into the dimensions of the ship a little later. So, we don't know much about the specific. Several had the title of Augustan Regiment. This Julius, as I said, it just mentions it factually. But Paul enjoyed the favor of Julius. He was actually allowed to take companions with him, so that was very unusual. The scriptures go on and record that Julius treated Paul kindly, gave him freedom to go receive care, told where the ship was at first, where it was going, and some of the trips along the way. The ship Paul was on, by the way, was a grain freighter, and it was carrying grain from Egypt to Italy. And it was about 140 feet long and 36 feet wide. So try to picture that. 140 feet long and 36 feet wide. So really, width-wise, it was about a little over a first down. If you can get that, that's how I always gauge things. And in length, it was almost 150 yards, half a football field. Had a big mast, a big sail. Instead of a rudder like we would think in modern ships, it had two paddles at the end of it, and that's what powered the ship on the back of it. They were sturdy, but because of the design of that, they had trouble sailing into the wind, which we'll find out was a problem they had back then. So they began to make its way west, eventually coming to a port called Fair Havens, which was south of the island of Crete. Let's pick the story up in verse 9. Let's see, now, when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them. And he said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, in other words, the cargo, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and owner of the ship more than the things which were spoken by Paul. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart from there also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenice, and there to winter, which is a haven of Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and the northwest. Again, that was on our map. So, there's a little bit of a controversy. Paul tells them his feelings on it. Now, we're not sure if Paul is speaking prophetically here by the Spirit of God. It's not clear. He simply said, I perceive. He could have perceived that because we find out in 1 Corinthians he'd already been shipwrecked before. He had spent some time sailing, so he knew the dangers of the ship. I personally don't think he knew more than the sailors who were in charge of sailing the ship. But in any event, they took a vote and decided to move on. That this place, Fair Haven, was anything but. The name was actually a misnomer. It was no place to stay. They wanted to go on to a better place to stay. And don't be confused by the wording where it says, because of the fast was past. That simply means that the time of wintertime and sailing, favorable sailing, was past. They were already into the time of year when it was not safe to sail, when it was best to stay out of the water because it was kind of like their wintertime. That's what is meant by the time, it was of the fast was over, not eating. There is fasting in this chapter, but I just wanted to draw the difference between the two. No surprise that those that had the most to lose by losing the shipment of grain, the people who were the prisoners, they voted that we should go on. Well, of course. So they didn't take, remember verse 9 says, much time was spent and sailing was dangerous. So just picture being out there on the water, rough seas, and Paul said, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only to the cargo, but also our lives. So he gave them a warning. But verse 11 tells us they got the opinion of the owner of the ship, and they got the opinion of the others, and they said, no, we need to go. Just don't pay attention to him. He's just a prisoner. What does he know? We're seasoned sailors. But they had a lot to lose. They had money to lose. They'd get in trouble for not delivering the prisoners. We all remember, hopefully from the New Testament, that if a prisoner escaped, the guards were held responsible and sometimes had to pay with their lives. So they didn't want the prisoners to escape, and they didn't want all their gain, all the grain that was going to be sold, to be lost, because then they'd be in trouble with the owners. So the decision was made to sail, regardless of what Paul had said, and it's no surprise. They had much to lose. The place where they at was not a fun place to spend winter, and the crew of the ship did not look forward to months in Fair Haven because it was a very small village and small town with nothing to do. It was boring. It didn't have a lot to offer, and the thought of them staying there until the weather improved months later was not something that they liked. One commentator suggested that the local Chamber of Commerce named it Fair Haven to try to put a happy face on a boring city. But they took the majority, they took a vote, and they decided to sail another 40 miles away. It didn't seem crazy to them to make it to Phoenix and be spared a miserable winter at Fair Haven. but they failed to properly regard the wise word from the Apostle Paul, which is going to turn out to be prophetic, when he said the voyage will end with disaster and much loss. They should have listened to him, as Paul will tell them later on in the chapter. All right, verse 13. And the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosed from there and sailed close by Crete. So they made a decision to go, and the winds were calm, everything seemed good. Verse 14, but not long after, there arose against it tempestuous wind called Euroclydon, just the local name for it. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up under the wind, we let her drive. In other words, just go wherever the wind would take it. And running under a certain island which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, strake sail, and so were driven. And we, being exceedingly tossed with tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. So, started out good, quickly turned bad. They're about to find out that what Paul warned was coming to be, and by the wording of it, by the way, it's almost as if Luke himself was, put into the service of pulling up the ropes to try to help the ship. And now they were trying to throw things off the ship to lighten it. It's about to shipwreck. They can tell already it's going to tip over. It's going to wreck. They need to lighten the load. So they did everything they could. These were normal emergency measures, helped to prevent the ship from being torn apart in a storm. The fear of crashing on it's called the Citrus Sands, was another place here. It was an infamous wrecking area of ships off the coast, and it made them go on and give up trying to navigate the ship. So they did what they could. There were two final things to do to save the ship. First, throwing over the cargo, a lot of money, and then the ship's equipment. But even this, the ship continued to drive in the wind for many days. Now look at verse 20. This was verse 19. And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. So they're throwing everything overboard. And verse 20. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. That's probably the saddest verse in this chapter. Years ago, when I first read this, I thought it was strictly the despair of it being cloudy and dark and windy and stormy all the time that drove them to desperation. I didn't think far enough into it, and whatever commentary I was reading didn't mention it, but we're told, verse 20, neither sun nor stars in many days appeared. How did they navigate in those days? The sun, the star. They couldn't tell where they were going. They're blind. So they're hopeless. They've thrown everything overboard, saved enough food and water, and it continues to be one winter, not like our winter, but one winter day of dark, no sun, no stars. We don't know where we're going. We're tired. We're hungry. So much so that all hope that we should be saved was given up. That's what taken away means. Very sad situation. However, the Apostle Paul's about to come to the rescue. But after long abstinence, in other words, fasting, being without food, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, you should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and to God hath given thee all the men that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, Paul said, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as he has told me. Howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. So Paul goes ahead and shares the fact that he had an angel visit him. And it happened after a long period of fasting where he hadn't had any food, verse 21 tells us. And they too, they were probably trying to conserve their resources and just going without food for as long as they could. So Paul tells them that an angel stood by, a messenger, not Jesus that had appeared to Paul earlier in the book of Acts. Remember when he was in jail, but this was an angel telling him that to be of good cheer, nobody's going to die. The ship's going to be lost, but nobody's going to die. And God has even promised you the men, all 276 of them, that you're sailing with. I would side with those students of the Bible that say Paul probably had prayed for them, the men that he was sailing with, and asked the Lord to spare them, just my feelings, and that the angel was saying, your prayer's been answered. God's going to save all of you, but the ship's going to be lost. So he shares with them the angelic vision, tells them, the God that I serve, the God that I belong, here's what's going to happen. Don't be afraid. That's what the angel told Paul. Paul needed to hear that. There was no doubt that he was just a man, and that storm can cause anybody to fear. In his strong moments, one wrote, Paul knew he would make it to Rome because God promised it. And yet there was a literal storm that caused doubt, and Paul needed reassurance. And God sent him that through the angel. Paul couldn't keep this hope to himself. He had to pass this on to the men that he was sailing with. Paul said, I believe God. He didn't say, I believe in God. He said, I believe God. I believe what God's told me is going to come to pass. So Paul believed God when there was nothing else to believe. He couldn't believe the sailors, the ship, the sails, the wind, the centurion, human ingenuity, or anything else. Only God. And Paul said, I believe God. This wasn't fair weather faith. This was faith when things were going bad. This was faith when things were looking bleak. But Paul's unshakable confidence in God made him a leader among men, though he was a prisoner of Rome. The mixed news was that in these circumstances, to run aground might be fairly called a shipwreck. That's what he's basically telling them. We're going to shipwreck, but everybody's life will be all right. Interestingly, he uses the term a certain island, which kind of hints to us that God didn't tell him every little detail, which is often the way God works. He told him what he needed to know through the angel, and he reassured him. But Paul calls it a certain island that they were going to run aground on. So look at verse 27. But when the 14th night was come, 2 more weeks, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, in other words, some land, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should have fallen upon the rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea, under color as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion, to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. So then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let it fall off. What is that all about? As they got close to land, they got fearful and they were hungry. They wanted to escape. Paul knew if the ship was going to make it, that there had to be people who knew how to sail it. So his earlier prophecy was not going to hold up if they let just everybody go their own way. Every man for himself, in other words. And he told them, he said, unless these men stay, you can't be saved. He knew they had to stay together. The ship's passengers desperately needed the crew's expertise. And it could be fatal if the crew abandoned the passengers. Secondly, Paul probably sensed that God's promise to him about the lives of the whole ship company was if they stayed together. So the soldiers cut away the ropes and let it fall so that they couldn't escape. So at this point, the soldiers had great trust in Paul. Remember before they had sided with the experts and the owners. So Paul encourages the passengers at dawn after 2 weeks and tells them not a hair of their head will fall from them. Boy, is that good news. Verse 33, and while the day was coming on, Paul besought them to take meat to eat something and said, "This day is the 14th day that you have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you." And when he had thus spoken, he took bread, gave thanks to God in presence of them all, and when he had broken, he began to eat. And they were all of good cheer, and all took some meat, and were in the ship 216 souls. And when they had eaten enough, they lighted from the ship and cast the wheat into the sea. So they threw the remaining food overboard after they'd had a meal. And when it was day, they knew not the land. They didn't know where they were, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, under which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. And when they had taken up anchors and committed themselves to the sea, and loosed the rubber bands, and hoisted the mainsail to the wind, and made toward the shore. And falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hind part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. Wow, talk about staying true to their duty. What they were staying true to is they didn't want to be held accountable for the escaped prisoners. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, didn't let them kill the prisoners, and commanded that they which could swim, cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest, some on boards, some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. So they don't know it's Malta yet, but they're on Malta. And just as Paul told them that they would live, but that the ship would be destroyed, that's exactly what happened. They tried everything they could and kept it going as long as they could, even to the point of throwing the remaining wheat overboard that they were eating. One final thought about that, and then we'll talk. To me, when I'm reading about how Paul shared the food and meat with them, it sounds like communion, doesn't it? It sounds like he prayed and divvied out the food, gave thanks to God, verse 35 said. He took the bread, gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and when he had broken the bread, they began to eat. Now, that could have been just breaking the bread or the loaf of bread, but that sure does sound like communion. And what a promise he gave them. He said, I pray to take something to eat. You've been a long time and you haven't eaten. This is for your health, and there shall not be one hair fall from the head of any of you. So you're not going to die. You're going to make it. That was good news to them after all this time. They were in peril of the sea, and they were scared. So Paul encouraged them. But as he had prophesied, as he had predicted, the ship did shipwreck. You know, it's the way it's worded. It's nicely worded. You know, the front part stuck, and the back of the ship shook, but it broke. And verse 44 makes it clear. Some of them were floating on pieces of board, debris. Some were able to swim, but now they were on the island of Malta. And that'll be next week's discussion. But little hint, the inhabitants of the island of Malta were not the nicest people in the world to them. So.
They weren't pleased to have company.
Right. All right, let's talk about it.